US President Donald Trump threw the whole world into a tizzy last week when he announced tariff policies of the US. Some called it fair to the US, some others called it catastrophic for both the US and the rest of the world. One media outlet actually said that Mr. Trump, in one afternoon, had undone a century's worth of globalization. How dire is the economic situation for the US and the world, and what are the implications for India? Hello and welcome back to Business Matters with the Hindu with me, K. Bharat Kumar. As is evident from the diversity of response following Mr. Trump's tariff policy announcements, no one is exactly sure how things will roll out in the coming months and probably even years. For one, this has not happened in the US for several decades now, and global trade has changed too much water under the bridge in that time. And two, it all depends on how impacted countries react. For instance, China has taken a retaliatory approach, while Vietnam and Taiwan are examples of countries that are willing to negotiate with the US so that their products find favor in America. Nevertheless, here are 7 things that you ought to know now that Mr. Trump has rolled out his tariff policy and is standing firmly by it. First off, this is not the first time that the US is using tariffs with an eye on promoting the interests of both its industries and people. The Smoot-Hawley Act of 1930 in the US raised tariffs on imported goods by about 20%. About 25 countries raised tariffs in retaliation, as a result of which many economists believe the Great Depression that America went through actually worsened. It was a pretty painful period. Interestingly, the US had raised tariffs in a prior period, 1890 to be exact, via an act named after future President William McKinley. The reactions were mixed at this time. Some industries like tin plate manufacturing benefited, but in general, the prices for consumers started increasing. In the 1890 midterm elections, voters punished Republicans. The tariff became a major campaign issue, with opponents arguing that it benefited big business at the expense of ordinary Americans. How did the US this time around arrive at those tariff percentages for each country that it trades with? The formula that you see on your screens now is the formula that the US Trade Representative's Office used to arrive at those percentages. Bloomberg columnist John Authors says it looks very impressive, but that's because it is in Greek, and he calls it nonsense, and here's why. The math is simple according to Reuters. Take the US goods trade deficit of the country, divided by that country's exports to the US, and turn it into a percentage figure. Then cut that figure in half to produce the US reciprocal tariff with a floor of 10%. Mr. Authors of Bloomberg indicates that the tariff percentage that has been arrived at uses the trade gap but not the trade barriers that exist between the US and the countries it trades with. So, a poor country that exports far more to the US than it imports from the US is penalized heavily. And there is an obvious reason why more exports from Asia go into the US than vice versa, because the labor is cheaper there. And it's unlikely that the US can meaningfully send anything that's affordable to some of these poor countries in Asia. Now, here's how a reciprocal tariff would look like. Assume, just for example, that India and US trade with each other in cheese. So the cheese that goes from India to the US would have a tariff percentage of 2%. And that coming in from the US into India has 10%. So obviously, there's an imbalance. So the US says, I'm going to raise this tariff percentage from 2% to 10% so that we are on an even keel. Then that is a reciprocal tariff. But that's not what the US has done recently. 3. What has been the thinking behind the Trump administration's actions on tariff? If you listen to a few things that people in the administration have said in the public domain in the past few weeks, you'll get some inkling. Recently, at the American Dynamism Summit in the US, Vice President J.D. Vance indicated how the administration intends to make it easier for innovators to build within the US rather than outsource manufacturing to other parts of the world. So the 4 points he made are as follows. First, the US tax code will allow 100% bonus depreciation for capital investments as well as full expensing for R&D. For business owners, including manufacturers, making the 2017 tax cuts permanent will provide further confidence and predictability to invest in new technology and in equipment, as well as hire more American workers. He also said that the administration would use tariffs to protect industries. Finally, he said the US would increase energy production to lower costs and fuel innovation. In another conversation, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, in a podcast with Tucker Carlson, made a couple of observations. First, he said in the summer of 2024, more Americans than ever took a vacation in Europe. And in that same period, summer of 2024, more Americans than ever walked into food banks and supplemented their grocery purchases. Food banks are places where people get food for free. And in this instance, he observed it was not just the homeless people, but the middle-class American who supplemented his grocery purchases with food from those banks. He said that wasn't a great sight, and he believes that America must do more for these people and help bring down prices. Now, point number 4, that brings us to this question. Will prices come down for the average American in the near term? Like maybe Mr. Trump and his team believe, eventually, in the medium to long term, things will start looking better for the US, more manufacturing will happen within the borders of the US, more Americans would get jobs and so on, but the near-term pain seems rather obvious. Take Apple, for example. It has 1.5 billion iPhone users and 2.4 billion iPad users. Dan Ives at Wedbush Securities, a brokerage firm, says that a majority of Apple's production takes place in Asia, particularly China. He adds, we estimate the vast majority of iPhone production is out of China, over 50% of Mac products and 75 to 80% of iPads. This brings us to today, that is the day after the tariff announcements, with Apple stock getting crushed along with the rest of tech as the Trump tariff slate with 34% for China, which is actually 54% including baseline tariffs, and 32% for Taiwan are so absurd, in his words. And he says that they believe that Cook, who's the CEO of Apple, and Apple executives themselves must be staring at this tariff chart and wondering what is next. Mr. Ives points out that Apple has already announced an investment of $500 billion. Tim Cook said this along with Mr. Trump in February of 2025. But the analyst points out that even to move 10% of the supply chain from China into the US, it would take 3 years and $30 billion. And that assuming a major disruption in the process. For US consumers, he says, the reality of a $1,000 iPhone being one of the best-made consumer products on the planet would disappear. If consumers want a $3,500 iPhone, we should make them in New Jersey or Texas or another US state. The concept of making iPhones in the US is a non-starter at $1,000. Mr. Ives ends his note to investors, indicating that Apple products, especially iPhones, at $1,000 if made within the US is a fantasy tale that he believes will never happen. Now, point number 5 for this episode. How will a global trade war affect India's trade relations with the rest of the world? Though observers say India is less impacted than China, Taiwan or Vietnam for now, that is little consolation. In the best case scenario, we could expect supply chains, for example, in the textile sector, to start moving to India from nations on which the US levies higher tariffs. But the challenge would likely come from those very countries who would be willing to negotiate with the US, like Vietnam and Taiwan have already indicated, saying that they would negotiate. India itself has shown a willingness to negotiate, and in some instances, for some items, it has already started bringing down these import tariffs. That it would actually impact the government's duty collections is another conversation altogether, of course. There are already a couple of pain points for India that have begun emerging on the horizon. First off, till the future of the US's tariff policy remains uncertain, that is, you never know, Mr. Trump and his administration may go back on their announcements, be willing to negotiate, give discounts, so on. Till that uncertainty exists, US buyers will start negotiating with suppliers for discounts. Media reports already suggest that US buyers have started negotiating, started having conversations with Indian suppliers and seeking discounts in the range of 10 to 15% already. And 2, if India does give concessions to the US as part of any free trade agreement, then other countries with whom we are negotiating similar pacts will also seek equally benign treatment. And these are countries such as the UK and Australia and regions such as the European Union. Point number 6 for this episode. How will all this impact the potential for GDP growth for India? As the IMF and EU have already pointed out, global economy is already looking shaky. But this would certainly have a negative impact on Indian economic growth. In a note, Morgan Stanley researchers said that the US's tariff move will likely drag India's economic growth down by 30 to 60 basis points from its FY26 growth estimate of 6.5%. In his annual letter to shareholders, JP Morgan Chase chief Jamie Dimon has indicated that these tariff moves are raising the probability of a recession in the US. But despite such dire predictions, Mr. Trump seems unfazed. He's actually come out and said that when things have to be set right, it's like taking medicine. What he probably means is that there are side effects that will be unpleasant but which are necessary. And we come to the final point number 7 for this episode. How much does India import from the US? What are the top items it imports? And some idea of exports, the differential in tariff rates levied by each of these countries on the other. Let's take a look at some of the information that Minister of State Jitin Prasada of the Commerce Ministry gave out in response to a question in the Lok Sabha last month. First off, how much does India import from the US? The chart on your screens shows data ranging from year 2020 to 2024. And though it was high in the COVID years, right now we stand at imports by India from the US at $42.8 billion. The time period taken is January to December for that particular year. Next, what are the top 5 items of import and what are the effective tariff rates? The top 5 import items from the US are mineral fuels, natural or cultured pearls, precious and semi-precious stones, nuclear reactors and boilers, electrical machinery, optical, photographic, cinematographic, measuring, checking precision, and so on. You see that the simple average effective duty levied on import items from the USA range from 4.7% going all the way up to 10.9%. Now, to set that in contrast, here is some information on the goods that India exports to the US and the effective tariff rates that are applicable thereof. So on your screens, you see this chart that indicates electrical machinery, precious or semi-precious stones, pharma products, nuclear reactors, and mineral fuels. And if you look at data for the year 2024, you'll see the topmost item, whose value is about $12.5 billion. But the average duty the US levies on imports from India is 1.2%. Pharma products at $8.8 billion worth of exports by India, US levies 0.2%. Now, that brings us to the nuggets of information section of this episode. Americans eyeing cosmetic beauty treatments may have to eventually fork out more for their anti-wrinkle injections. He has said that he is indeed going to levy tariffs on pharmaceuticals at levels not seen before, though right now there are no new tariffs announced for the sector. AbbVie Inc., the company behind Botox, makes almost all of the product in the town of Westport on Ireland's west coast. Production takes place in a highly secure plant given that Botox is made from one of the world's most toxic substances, botulinum toxin. Any price increases from tariffs will hit US consumers as Botox for aesthetic purposes isn't covered by insurance. AbbVie reported almost $1.7 billion worth of Botox cosmetic sales in 2024, plus another $2.7 billion in sales for therapeutic purposes. And here's a quiz question for this week. Nespresso from Nestle is popular worldwide. Now the question is, how many of these coffee capsules does Nestle sell worldwide and where does it make them? And here's the answer to last week's question. When was the word telecommunication first used? The earliest known use of the word telecommunications in English is from 1932, stemming from the word télécommunication and meaning communication over long distance by electrical means. That's all we have for you folks in this episode on tariffs, but stay tuned. This tariffs is a topic that won't end quickly and there's lots to happen, and we'll dive into the turmoil and bring out nuggets of insights from you as much as possible. Stay with us. And if you enjoyed watching this episode, do not forget to like, share and subscribe. Until we meet again, have a lovely time ahead.